Welcome, everyone, to Scheller Lunchtime Live, a live stream series hosted by the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. My name is Lindsay Kane, and I'm the Associate Director of Client Relationships for non-degree executive education programs. On select Fridays at 12 p.m. Eastern, you'll have the chance to hear from Scheller faculty, student, and alumni speakers as they discuss relevant topics for the tech-driven digital age. At Scheller, we're proud to offer undergraduate, MBA, and PhD programs along with open enrollment and custom executive education programs. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Badura, Assistant Professor of Organizational Behavior at Scheller. Katie received her PhD in Organization and Human Resources Management from the State University of New York at Buffalo. Her research includes two primary lines of inquiry: leadership emergence and personality. In particular, she investigates the process through which individuals emerge as leaders within organizations and how personality impacts employee, team, and firm level outcomes. She is also interested in understanding the role that surface level individual differences like gender and disability have in the workplace. Her work has been featured in top academic outlets, including the Academy of Management Journal, the Journal of Applied Psychology, and Personnel Psychology and Psychological Bulletin. Today, Katie will discuss where a sense of impunity comes from, the implications it has for the workplace, and how you can best avoid its pitfalls as an employee and manager. As always, feel free to ask questions in the comments section. Katie will address as many questions as possible at the end of her presentation. Over to you, Katie.
All right, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here and having the opportunity to talk about impunity, and this has become a topic that's been really near and dear to my heart over the last few years as we've started to work on this research. And so I'm going to share a little bit about what we've found in the last few years and really where I see this area going moving forward. And so we're going to really be just having a conversation about impunity at work. And as you go through really the mainstream media of acts of impunity to figure out where this is, how prevalent it is, you can find many different examples. One of the ones that sticks out in my mind is a recent example, which is WeWork. WeWork is an interesting organization with a lot of co-working space, even right next door to our building right here. And as the WeWork company was looking to move into a IPO, and what came to light was a lot of problematic behavior with the CEO. There was a lot of alleged behavior. Not all of it's been confirmed, but some of the greatest things that have come through in the media have been around drug use and both eccentric and erratic behavior, excessive spending, mismanagement, and this ultimately culminated in the botched IPO for the company. Interestingly, what we saw in this organization, however, was that as the organization as a collective entity was struggling, we saw the CEO walk away with a very lucrative package. And so the CEO ended up walking away with hundreds of millions of dollars. What I have here are the estimates of a renegotiated deal. And so he walked away with $245 million in company stock, $200 million in cash, and he's actually in the process of starting a new business called Flow, where he has some investor funding. We also have thousands of employees that were laid off, and many that experienced a significant financial loss as they believed that betting on the company was a sure gain, and it ultimately produced sort of this negative ramification for them. And so as we step back and we think about the WeWork example, we have an instance where a individual or small group of individuals are engaging in behaviors that are not necessarily expected within an organization. Some might even call it misconduct. And through that, they end up not necessarily being punished. And so in the case here, we have the CEO who's walking away with a lot, and we have the employees who really face the punishment. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about the concept of impunity. Impunity historically has been studied in the criminal justice literature and in the legal domain more broadly. And the way researchers have really looked at this concept is an exemption or protection from penalty and punishment. Oftentimes, as we think about this research, we're thinking of human rights violations or strong illegal action that's happening where the actors are ultimately getting away with what it is that they're doing. One of the most interesting things with impunity as we've started to really work in this area is that it has recently been labeled the age of impunity. And so David Miliband, who is the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, has highlighted that the instances of impunity have just absolutely exacerbated over the last several years, where people believe they can get away with anything. And because they believe that, they do everything that they really want to. Interestingly, as we started to think about this concept, we asked ourselves how much this has really been studied in the workplace. We know it's prevalent in terms of people who think that they can get away with misconduct, but don't actually face any sort of punishment. But there wasn't really a lot of scholarly research on this. And this has actually led to a 3.5 year journey with my team to learn more about the role of impunity at work. And when I talk about how novel and rare this research is, I was telling the folks in our exec ed office as we were getting ready to do this presentation, as I was putting together the slide deck, and I was looking for pictures to include, and I searched workplace impunity. My face came up from this particular advertisement. And so, at minimum, what we're doing here in Scheller is really, I think, on the forefront of some of this research and can be foundational to really where we move. And so while I hope I'm not eventually going to be the face of impunity, I do think we're doing some really novel research here. But I have to be very clear that this research that we're performing isn't simply something that is driven by me. It is driven by Min-Young Lee, who's the lead author on the project. She just graduated from Georgia Tech last year as a PhD student. She's currently doing a postdoc as a research associate at UNC Chapel Hill. And she's really been the driver of this project, the intellectual leader. And this has been work that's done alongside my colleague here at Scheller College of Business, Bradford Baker, who's an assistant professor of organizational behavior. And so this is really the team that has been working for the last few years to really think about these concepts and to not only develop a measure, but to figure out how we understand this concept in the workplace. And the first step of any good research project is to try and figure out what is that we're actually studying. And while this feels like it might be a simple notion, because there is research that exists on impunity in other fields, that research is simply a little bit different than what we're doing in organizations. And so when we're starting to look at things like human rights violations and illegal behavior at such a high level in an organization, the challenge becomes that those are pretty rare acts, and they often happen in the highest echelons of leadership. And so we were looking for something that is very broadly defined and impacts most of the employees that operate in an organizational setting. And so as we step back, we really reflected on what we think impunity is, and we are focused more on people's perceptions or their subjective views of the environment that they're operating in. And so we have defined workplace impunity as an individual's personal belief that they will not be punished for wrongdoing. And this can encapsulate their belief that their organization does not necessarily punish employees in general in their organization, as that's a key consideration as we start to build our own thoughts around impunity. And so as we had figured out what the concept was, the next step was to actually figure out what facilitates perceptions of impunity. And we've collected this data a few times across multiple samples. And what we have found in many instances is three different concepts that have come to light in terms of people's internal characteristics. And so I have the definitions listed here. Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and moral identity all relate to how people really see the world in terms of punishment and their willingness to sort of evade the authority that exists. And so Machiavellians tend to use manipulative and deceitful tactics to undermine others in the pursuit of outcomes. Psychopathy are individuals who have a lack of concern for other people, social regulatory mechanisms, and wrongdoing. And moral identity is the extent to which we really identify or see ourselves along the lines of different moral characteristics of what's right and wrong. And so I know you see the term psychopathy, and you think of psychopaths and such a small base rate, but we're thinking of this sort of in an organizational setting on more of a truncated range of 1 to 7, where you will actually have people that fall in this range. And so what we actually found was that individuals who are higher on Machiavellianism and psychopathy both end up having these perceptions of impunity. So they both believe that they're not going to be punished when they do something wrong in an organization. Along these lines, moral identity actually has a different trend. We find that people who have a strong sense of morality intertwined into who they are feel as though they're going to face that punishment. And so we sort of had these two tensions happening here of things that both can produce the sense of impunity and that can decrease the sense of impunity. And these are all going to be traits that are internal to the people or inherent in their personality. At the next point, however, we realized that it really isn't sufficient to focus on personality. And a lot of this came through the peer review process, where others read our research and said, I think there's more happening than simply who people are. There's more that can happen in organizations that produce this sense of impunity. And what we started with in terms of these thoughts here were related to bottom line mentality and ethical leadership. And so bottom line mentality focuses sort of on this one-dimensional frame of thinking where we're trying so hard to reach outcomes that we do so at the expense of other important things in an organization. On the flip side, we have ethical leadership, which is really valuing the right and wrong moral yardstick that exists within your organization and ensuring that you're engaging in that normatively appropriate conduct. We find that that bottom line mentality piece actually increases perceptions of impunity. And a lot of the thinking behind that is that as individuals seek to reach outcomes, they may forget about the means through which they're working to get to those outcomes. And so the end goal becomes so important that the process gets forgotten along the way. From that ethical leadership standpoint, we know the leader sets an important tone in that organization. When they have a strong sense of ethics, it is likely that they're engaging in that behavior. They're really, walking that walk, not just talking the talk in terms of what they expect from people. And so when somebody errs in terms of their misconduct, an ethical leader will likely step in and try and right that wrong. And the last component in terms of where we thought impunity would originate from is in terms of the environments where people operate. We have two thoughts here, formalization, which is the extent to which an organization is characterized by rules and procedures, and we have autonomy, where we give our employees a lot of flexibility. Both of these, in many respects, have a thread of oversight. And if you're in a culture that's high on formalization, you're going to have more oversight. If you're in a culture that's high on autonomy, you're going to have less oversight. And so what we actually found in this particular research is that that oversight is key in terms of whether people actually experience a sense of impunity. So when you have that high oversight, such as high formalization or low autonomy, where you have that oversight, that is where we have impunity being reduced in those environments. If you're high on autonomy or if you're low on formalization, that's where impunity might end up breeding and becoming a problem for your work unit. And so we learned some lessons here. Impunity wasn't simply a manifestation of who we are. It's a manifestation of the environments that we're in. And so our leaders matter. The environment that is being created at the organizational level matters. And this is actually really helpful because it means that we can move the needle in terms of bad behavior in the workplace. If it was simply inherent to people, we can try and prevent those people from getting into the workplace, but that's not always a long-term solution. We can use leadership to create an environment that is more positive for people. We also know that hiring moral and ethical leaders isn't simply a practice that will prevent maladaptive behaviors. It increases people's receptivity to the punishment process. And so they're going to be more likely to see the connection between wrongdoing and punishment. And so it helps us to really understand this mechanism through which we have problematic outcomes emerging. The last thing, which I think is often one of the most interesting things that emerges, is companies often value task orientation so heavily, reaching the end goal, reaching their key performance indicators, those KPIs. But if we focus too heavily on those bottom line outcomes, it actually could have unintended consequences. And this is one of the most interesting things that's come across when I go into organizations and collect data, that this bottom line outcome mentality is much more problematic than we realize. And this is one reason why that people really might engage in sort of bad actions so that they can sort of skirt those outcomes and reach the desired outcomes they can get to. We finished this study by trying to figure out what exactly impunity perceptions lead to. And we focused on 5 different outcomes. The first 4 that are listed here are pretty dark in nature. And so we're talking about behavior that intends to harm, hinder different actions or outcomes of people. And so these are more intentional processes that are aimed at preventing, good things from happening in the organization. We have, violation of norms and ethics is something else that is happening there. And we also have task performance. And so what we found was that impunity simultaneously increased the counterproductive behavior, social undermining, incivility, and unethical behavior. And it also prevented people from realizing their normal task performance. And so when people were sort of skirting these expected norms, they were less likely to perform in general. And so across the board, we see this as not only harming an organization from the standpoint that you're harming your peers and employees, but people simply aren't getting their job done. And where this left us in terms of lessons learned was that impunity is really a problematic concept for organizations. We know that when you have any sort of maladaptive outcome happening, it's incredibly costly to organizations. And so impunity is one way in which we realize this is happening, and it needs to be minimized in organizations. And I'm going to just talk in a few minutes about how we can actually work towards minimizing that. We also know that employees are going to not only fall short in terms of their in-role performance expectations, but they're also going to potentially undermine their peers. And that means it has potential trickle effects into organizations. And that's that third point. We actually haven't had the opportunity yet to study this, but there's some related constructs that show that when bad behavior happens in organizations, it sometimes permeates through the work units. And so what we think could happen with being in the environment with somebody who is high on impunity, it may end up trickling to other people, not necessarily in that they're also going to feel a sense of impunity, though that's possible. They may simply enjoy being in their workplace less. They may be less motivated and experience sort of these negative outcomes along the way. And so this is going to be something that is particularly helpful to understand. And so as we transition and think about some of the practical advice that we can actually provide to our leaders on how we handle this process, I think the first place to start is to think about the role of leaders and how you sort of set goals and expect results. And so, we sometimes become so driven on the outcomes, we forget the process through which people get there. And so we need to really step back and ensure that we have the right protocols in place to not necessarily encourage wrongdoing. There's a lot of very prolific examples that have emerged in the popular press. You can think of companies like Enron and even Wells Fargo recently, where you have people engaging in unethical behavior simply to reach the outcomes that they were supposed to get to. And so we want to make sure that as leaders, we're not incentivizing people to do the wrong thing. There's some things we can do along the way, and that point 4 and 5 in particular that can help us in terms of rewards and punishment. From the standpoint of the behavior we choose to model, our employees learn a lot simply by what we show the world. And so we want to model the behavior we'd like to see. If we want our employees to act with ethics, we need to be ethical leaders in the workplace. If we want our employees to act with a low sense of impunity, we don't want them in an environment where they feel as though they can get away with that misconduct, then we need to recognize that we can't get away with misconduct. And so modeling the behavior that we'd like to see is really important. We want to balance our autonomy with oversight. This is really important. We know from a strong bulk of literature on motivation that autonomy is actually viewed as something that is really positive in organizations. Because what you're doing is you're allowing your employees to go out and figure out how it is that they want to do work rather than being micromanaged. And that's really attractive for a lot of employees because they're able to have flexibility in their day-to-day life. At the same time, we know that without some kind of checked power, some oversight that exists, that the belief that people can get away with misconduct can emerge. And so we need to balance really the motivational tendencies that can emerge as it relates to autonomy with the potential for ramifications or bad actions that can emerge when autonomy might be too high. And so we want to make sure we're cautious of that balance. It is incredibly tough as leaders to follow through on rewards and punishment. One of the more enjoyable things that you can do as a leader is to praise employees who are ethical, even when it's tough. For employees, it is not always the most easy path to be ethical or to engage in a behavior that is avoiding the misconduct. Sometimes it's easier to engage in misconduct than it isn't. And when we are leaders, we can acknowledge those challenges that our employees are facing to encourage them to be successful in the long term. The last piece here is in terms of the feedback and punishment we give. We know that a lot of leaders don't necessarily like to engage in sort of that negative feedback process and often like to avoid conflict. But this is problematic because that is exactly what engenders a sense of impunity. And so you need to really follow through as a leader on the feedback that you're providing. If somebody is acting with misconduct, you need to provide that constructive criticism or criticism to make sure that they are moving the needle in terms of their behavior. If their behavior is so egregious that it warrants punishment or documentation, that is something we need to follow through on, even if it creates uncomfortable conversations. We know with everything in terms of the dark behaviors it creates, that's going to be really key towards the long term of making sure that your employees are not engaging in those behaviors in the future. And so this is going to help to tamp down any feelings of impunity that might emerge in the workplace. In terms of practical advice for our employees, it's really important to realize your own personality tendencies. And so just because somebody is high on Machiavellianism or high on psychopathy or low on moral identity doesn't mean that they're actually going to get away with the misconduct. It means that they think they're going to get away with the misconduct. And so that misalignment can be challenging for people because they still may face punishment, even though they don't think they're going to. And so it's important to recognize your own personality, to recognize that there might be misalignment, and to perhaps reframe the way you think to make sure that you don't fall susceptible to engaging in these behaviors, because it can still come back to harm you. Strive to be ethical is something I always, interact with as I speak with, employees and leaders. When you're trekking into that gray area, consult with somebody. Whoever you view as the most ethical individual around you, talk to them to recalibrate what is right versus wrong. That will help you to avoid falling prey to the belief that you're not going to be punished for the wrongdoing. In the absence of oversight, you can work to create your own oversight, and you might do this through self-reflection. And so we don't always have leaders that provide the oversight. We might be operating in an environment with a high degree of autonomy, and that can be, as I mentioned earlier, incredibly helpful. But we do want to make sure that we provide our self-checks to make sure that we're thinking through what is good and bad and what should be performed and what shouldn't be performed. And so that'll allow us to step back. And along these lines, we want to make sure that we're really thinking about our own moral yardstick. And so we want to have the litmus test of what we believe is good versus bad, and work towards thinking about our performance and our decisions related to that yardstick, rather than justifying our actions compared to other people. Because you might be in an environment that a lot of people engage in sort of these unethical behaviors. And so your yardstick might be skewed if you end up comparing yourself to other people. So we want to make sure that we're looking internally at those types of decisions and thinking about our performance there to avoid developing the sense of impunity, to make sure we have those safeguards in place. And so that is everything from my side. I was told 12:25, open it up for questions. And so we're at the question point. So I'm going to ask Lindsay to hop back in and to let me know what needs to be answered.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Katie. There's some really great chatter going on, but there's a question about how do you go about praising employees who are ethical, especially when being ethical is tough?
Yeah, so there's different ways you can offer praise to people. The first question is whether you offer it in public or private. And so I usually say to tailor it to the employee. The upside of offering it in public is that other people see it and they can model their behavior off of that individual. The upside of private is that it sometimes is more meaningful to employees to be in that environment. Uh, you know, I would say just, unlike or like any other type of feedback, you just highlight what it is that the employee did and say that you really valued what they did and, it was a difficult decision and one that could have gone either way and, thank them for their ethics along the way. And so I don't think it's much different than providing normal feedback, barring the fact that you really do need to think about where you're going to provide the feedback and what exactly you're going to say. And that's usually something that you do with all type of feedback, or you should do with all type of feedback.
Right. So I'm sure throughout the research that you all are doing, you're looking at companies who have hybrid work environments, virtual work environments, and imagine, impunity must be especially difficult to manage with remote teams. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this has been an interesting divide. I've had a lot of conversations during the pandemic and as we shifted to remote and now as we're shifting back partially in person and how people sort of manage those processes along the way. In terms of that remote aspect, I think it's just important to stay connected to your employees. And so what has sometimes happened is employees feel a disconnect between the people that are on their teams, their leaders, and they don't necessarily see that oversight. And so making sure that you have goals that you're working towards, interacting with your subordinates as a leader, subordinates interacting with your leaders, and making sure that sense of connectedness is present so that you can have those conversations. And then again, as people, maybe do the wrong thing, having those constructive conversations early in the process rather than waiting until, the performance appraisal 6 months later to actually tell them what they did wrong. And so making sure you're having the conversations along the way.
So we heard some, I don't want to say great examples, but examples about poor behavior. Do you have any examples of more ethical behavior?
Ooh, ethical behavior has become more of a challenge because oftentimes we do not necessarily communicate when people are doing the right thing. And so as I'm going through this, I'm trying to mentally think of an organization that I think is pretty good here. And one of the challenges is that you never know what's going to come down the pike as you name one. One of the companies that sort of comes to mind right now, and it's part of the shift in terms of the fact that they've just decided to, I believe, donate all of their profits, and that's Patagonia is coming to mind as potentially a relatively ethical company, but I might be conflating sustainability a little bit with ethics right now, but that's one that potentially comes to mind. But I have way more toxic companies come to mind, which admittedly before this, I told Lindsay not to get me into a defamation lawsuit. And so we're much happier to be on the nice side right now.
And I think we have time for one last question, but how much does electronic communication impact how we share ethical praise? Does it impact the timing?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of the richness of the media in particular, if you're seeing things over email, that can sometimes be challenging to parse out what it is people are doing. And so, I'd say from the the richness of the communication mode is actually pretty important. And so if you're in a meeting, I think if somebody does the right thing, you can actually praise it pretty quickly. If it's an immediate thing, you might not realize how difficult something is though. And so I do think you can step back and eventually come back and say, I realized, after the meeting, how difficult that was. And I just want to thank you for having the courage to say that, or to be the person who is willing to break the groupthink trend in our group and be the devil's advocate as we had those conversations. And so I do think that's that you can offer it immediately, or you can offer it a little bit longer term, and you can be fine either way.
Well, thank you so much, Katie. This was really interesting, and I know there are loads more questions that we haven't gotten to, so hopefully you'll be able to address those on LinkedIn directly. But our next Scheller Lunchtime Live is Friday, November 4th at 12 p.m. Eastern, featuring Tim Halloran, Senior Lecturer of Marketing at Scheller. Tim will examine the role of the customer journey map and how it can add value to the customer experience. You can register for this event and learn more about future Scheller Lunchtime Live sessions by following the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business on LinkedIn. A recording of this session and future sessions will be available on our LinkedIn and YouTube pages as well. Thank you all for joining.